So no aspect of, okay, so the second point is that quite unconsciously, Americans have picked up a host of misconceptions. For example, many assume that the pre-Columbian North American was a sparsely populated virgin land, but that is not true. In fact, millions of Native Americans inhabited the area, which would become the United States. So in this section of the first Americans, we will discuss about the settlement of Americans by Paleo Indians and the ancestors of the New World Indians. It examines the diversity and size of Native American cultures and identifies the defining characteristics of the Indian cultures of North America on the eve of European contact. When the Europeans they arrived on the island. So we will discuss all these things in this section. Although few textbooks today use the word primitive, right? So just to describe pre-contact Native Americans, many still convey the impression that North American Indians consisted simply of small migratory bands that subsisted through hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants. As we shall see, this view is incorrect. This is not true. People used to believe that, they are used to live people in small groups, and they used to do hunting and fishing to survive, and they used to gather wild plants and they used to survive on that, but that's not true. These are all lies. So as we shall see, in this view is incorrect. In fact, Native American societies were rich, diverse, and sophisticated. These were pure cultures, and they were rich, they were diverse, and but still, some people won't believe, or many would have misconceptions that the American land was virgin. So food discovered and domesticated by Native Americans would transform the diet of Europe and Asia. Even when the Europeans they landed on the America, uh, the food that they saw there, they took the seeds from America to Europe and even to Asia, and that food was responsible for the productivity and the health of the European and Asian populations. So this is how rich and diverse these groups were, which were living, on the American island or the American continent. So Native Americans also made crucial, though often neglected, contributions to modern medicine, art, architecture, and ecology. Forget about some people living in groups and relying on hunting and fishing and surviving on surviving on wild plants. That is not true. They even invented medicine, and the art and architecture and ecology. They had so much knowledge of the area that in which they were living. So during the thousands of years preceding European continent, the Native American people developed inventive and creative cultures. They cultivated plants for food, dyes, medicines, and textiles, domesticated animals, established extensive patterns of trade. Those people, they used to trade, build cities, produced monumental architecture. If someone important when died, they used to honor him by making a monument on his in his name. So this is how much diverse those cultures were, and developed intricate systems of religious beliefs. They had a religion, and they used to believe in God, and constructed a wide variety of systems of social and political organization, ranging from kin-based bands and tribes to city-states and confederations. So Native Americans, not only adapted to diverse and demanding environments, they also reshaped the natural environments to meet their needs. They made canals. They used to bend rivers, and they used to bend streams to irrigate and to water their lands. So After the arrival of Europeans in the New World, Native Americans struggled intently to preserve the essentials of their diverse cultures while adapting to radically changing conditions. So much was done, huge damage was done to these cultures on the arrival of the European people when they arrived hundreds of years ago on the Americas. So approximately 30,000 years ago, the Paleo Indians, these are the ancestors of the Red Indians or the Native Americans, followed herds and of animals from Siberia across Beringia, a land bridge connecting Asia and North America into Alaska. And by 8000 BC, these peoples had spread across North and South America. So they used to, travel all the way to Siberia, and they were shepherds. They used to herd, followed herds of animals. So and in 8000 BC, they finally settled across the across the North and South American continent. So no one knows for sure how many Indians lived in the Western Hemisphere in 1492, but the number was in the millions. So when we say that we have misconceptions, we may say that, there were very few people, a few hundred people, but that's not the case. They were in millions. In no sense were the Americas empty lands. So what we are trying to establish here by understanding is that the America was populated, and it was populated well, and it was populated by people who were knowledgeable, who had culture, who were inventing medicine, you know. So in America's the early America, before the arrival of the Europeans, it was populated, and it was rich in culture. At least 2,000 distinct languages were spoken in the Americas in 1492. Such a diverse culture. Can you believe it? Cultural differences were marked. Some Indian peoples belonged to small bands of hunters and gatherers. Some practiced sophisticated irrigated agriculture. They had the knowledge how to grow crops, how to preserve the harvest, and how to use seeds for the next season. Complex agriculturally based cultures developed in a number of regions, including the Mayas and Aztecs in Mesoamerica, the Incas and in Peru, and the mound builders in Mississippians and in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. So these regions, they were highly populated because we have fertile land here. We grow crops, so when they used to grow crops on a land, so the women and the children, they also came and started living with these people. So these were highly rich cultures. So all Indians lived in organized societies with political structures. They had some sort of constitution. They had rules, some moral codes, and religious beliefs. So they were talented people. They were not people out of the jungle. They were well behaved. They had moral codes and religious beliefs. So all had adapted to a particular environments in which they lived. The idea of private land ownership was foreign. Land was held commonly, communally, and worked collectively. This was not the case that, okay, this is my land and that is your land. You should not come here and I cannot go there. That, these laws, they didn't exist back in the days. So, the land, all the land was for everyone, So, and they used to use that land they used to use that land mutually. For example, if I need something, I would go to other land, and I will do something. I will do whatever I want, and another people come to my area and they can do whatever they want, for a mutual benefit. So this was a beautiful concept without any borders and without any land ownership. So the largest domesticated animals were dogs, llamas, and alpacas, and therefore the Indians could not rely on such animal byproducts such as wool, leather, milk, and meat. They did not domesticated cows and buffaloes and all sorts of these sheeps, which we use today for domesticated purposes. So, they used to have dogs and other, small sheeps with them. So, although some societies had developed the wheel, it was used as a toy. This is very interesting. The wheel was discovered back then, but they did not know how to use it. It was just a toy. So no society had shaped metal into guns, swords, or tools. None had gunpowder, sailing ships, or mounted warriors. Such peaceful times, no weapons, no gunpowder, just peace. You can live wherever you want. You can do whatever you want, as long as you're not hurting anybody. So beautiful. So deadly epidemics also aided the European conquest. Diseases unfortunately came and attacked them. So the Indians were highly susceptible to European diseases. When the Europeans they landed and they came to the America, they brought diseases with themselves from Europe. You guys may have heard of the European plague or the Black Plague, which killed millions and millions of people in Europe and China and in Asia. So when the ships reached the Americas and in North America in particular, so during that time, they brought diseases. And when diseases spread in the Americas, so people started dying of those diseases. So, those diseases, they contained, smallpox, typhus, typhoid, typhus fever, diphtheria, plague, cholera, measles, and influenza appear to have been uncommon. Those people, the Native Americans, they were unfamiliar with these diseases. Measles, mumps, whooping cough, and other epidemics greatly reduced the Indian population because they were not immune to it. When you get a disease, after some time you get immune to it. But those people, it was their first time. So when a disease attacks you for the first time, there are high chances that you may get affected really bad because of that. So this was, a very unfortunate, and the Native Americans they started to die. So this was about the early Americans, and that who were the first people who were living. So now we are entering our second portion, which is key events in the early American history. And early events, the key events in early American history. This is the most darkest part of the American history. Lots of wars, and many people were killed, and lots of injustice was done. So let's begin, and let's see that which events were important in the early American history. Do you have any questions so far? Anyone? Let me see who is in the class. Aaron, are you getting it? Aaron, do you have any question? All right, if you have any question, you can type in chat. So I will proceed with the lecture. Okay, so the first one is the European expansion. When the American people, when they were attacked and they were enslaved by the Europeans. When the Europeans came during the mid and late 15th century, Europe gained mastery over the world's ocean currents and wind patterns and began to create a Europe-centered world economy. The Europeans, they were masters of making ships, and they knew how to travel, and how to cross seas and oceans. So Europeans developed astronomical instruments and trigonometrical tablets to plot the location of the sun and stars, replaced oarsmen with sails, and began to better understand wind patterns and ocean currents. So the knowledge was, exponential in Europe, and they used that knowledge to conquer the world, and they did. So the pioneer in European expansion was tiny Portugal, which after 1385 was a united kingdom and unlike other European countries was free from internal conflicts. It was at peace. There were no internal conflicts in Portugal. So Portugal focused its energies on Africa's western coast. It was Spain that would stumble upon the New World. So Portugal decided to colonize Africa, and Spain was the one who would stumble upon the New World. And by New World, we mean America. So Columbus underestimated the circumference of the Earth by one fourth and believed he could reach Japan by sailing 2,400 miles west from the Canary Islands. Until his death in 1506, he insisted that he had reached Asia, but he quickly recognized that the new lands could be a source of wealth from precious minerals and sugarcane. So he did not know that he has arrived to the new lands. He did not know. He was thinking that he has arrived at Asia. So the Columbian Exchange, there was another a key event in the American history, which is called the Columbian Exchange. So in the 15th and 16th century, voyages of discovery brought Europe, Africa, and the Americas into direct contact. So now all these people, they emerged and they interacted at one point, producing an exchange of foods, animals, and diseases that scholars call the Columbian Exchange. So they decided to trade. Goods were coming from Africa to America, and goods were going from America to Europe, and goods were coming back from Europe to America. So not only goods, but those goods they carried diseases and viral diseases and bacterial diseases. So the Indians taught Europeans about tobacco, corn, potatoes, and varieties of beans, peanuts, tomatoes, and other crops unknown in Europe. In return, Europeans introduced the Indians to wheat, oats, barley, and rice, as well as to grapes for wine and various melons. Europeans also brought with them domesticated animals, including horses, pigs, sheep, goats, and cattle. So all these animals, which were domesticated by the Europeans, they were eventually brought to Americas. So even the natural environment was transformed. When all this was happening in those times, so Europeans cleared vast tracts of forest land and inadvertently introduced old world weeds. So, when they removed forests, so the weeds they started to grow. So the introduction of cattle, goats, horses, sheep, and swine also transformed the ecology as grazing animals ate up many native plants and disrupted indigenous systems of agriculture. So this was a great loss to the Native Americans, where the disbalance of the nature occurred because of these animals. So the horse extant in the New World for 10,000 years. Horses, they did not exist on the American continent, encouraged many farming people to become hunters and herders. So the arrival of horses from Europe, it led to change in their uh, agriculture habits. They became hunters. Before they were growing food for themselves, and now they said that okay, why should we struggle so much, or why should we do so much hard work in the fields? Let's take a horse and hunt animals, and that's it. So and they eventually paid the price for changing their agricultural habits. So the exchange however, was not evenly balanced. Killer diseases killed millions of Indians. So the survivors were drawn into European trading networks that disrupted earlier patterns of life. So when many people died, so the rest of the people they became dependent on the European trade and European on the Europeans, and so the life which was before the arrival of the Europeans that was disrupted, and it was a great loss for the Red Indians and the first Americans. So, European colonization, there were three distinct forms of European colonization in the New World: empires of conquest, commerce, and settlement. So Europeans they started to colonize the Americas. So after that, Spain regarded the Indians as usable labor force, while France treated the Indians primarily as trading partners. So they started, they enslaved the red Indians, and they enslaved the American people, the first Americans, while France was more friendly towards these Indians, and primarily as trading partners. France used to trade with the Red Indians. So the English, in contrast, adopted a policy known as plantation settlement, the removal of the indigenous population and its replacement with uh, a native English and the Scots. So this again was, extremely harmful for the first Americans. They decided that we don't get rid of the first Americans. We don't want them. We don't like them. And instead of these Red Indians, the first Americans, we would eventually develop our own colonies. So for more than a century, Spain and Portugal were the only European powers with New World colonies. After 1600s, however, other European countries began to emulate their example. So, they started to copy the United Kingdom and Portugal and Spain. So France, since New World Empire was based largely on trade. So France also it made ships, and it got to know that how can we cross oceans, and the French people they started a trade with the first Americans. But by the end of the 16th century, 1,000 French ships a year were engaged in the fur trade along the St. Lawrence River and the interior, where the French constructed forts, missions, and trading posts were. So relations between the French and Indians were less violent than in Spanish or English colonies. Spanish people and English people, they were killing, and they were, removing the first Americans. So those were violent. And the French people, they were more friendly. In part, this reflected a small size of France's New World population, totaling just 3,000 in 1663. So virtually all these settlers were men, mostly traders or Jesuit priests, that many took Indian wives or concubines, helping to promote relations of mutual dependency. So when the French came to the Americas, they married the local or the first American people. They married the Red Indians. They married their women, and the women and the French women they married their men, and it was a mutual society with peace and harmony. And they were promoting Christianity there. So common trading interests were also encouraged, accommodation between the French and the Indians. So the French and Indians they were friendly, and the Spanish and English were the enemies. So English colonization, this is another key event in American history. So by English, we all know we mean the United Kingdom, Ireland, Scotland, England, and all the other adjacent areas. So including the 17th century, when England established its first permanent colonies in North America, a crucial difference arose between and the southernmost colonies, whose economy was devoted to production of stable crops and the more diverse economies of the northern colonies. So the English people, they started to disrupt these colonies. Okay, so initially settlers in the Chesapeake colonies of Maryland and Virginia relied on white indentured servants as their primary labor force, and at least some of the blacks who arrived in the region were able to acquire property. Slavery was no concept, people were paid for the work, and mostly the people who were working were white. But between 1640 and 1670, a sharp distinction emerged between short term servitude for whites and permanent slavery for blacks. So, as we all know, this is sadly one of the darkest parts of the world history and the American history, that the black people were enslaved, which are still fighting for their rights in today's America in 2023. And in 2022 and 2021, we see protests happening, and people writing on the roads that Black Lives Matters. So still, we are seeing the negativities of what happened in the 1960s and 1640s and 1670s. So in Virginia, Bacon's rebellion accelerated the shift towards slavery. By the end of the century, slavery had become the basic labor force in the southern colonies. So all the people who used to do hard work, they were from Africa, or they were blacks. So in New England, the economy was organized around small family farms and urban communities engaged in fishing, handicrafts, and Atlantic commerce, with most of the population living in small compact towns. In Maryland and in Virginia, the economy was structured around larger and much more isolated farms and plantations raising tobacco. So people in Maryland and Virginia, so their economies were small and isolated, and their main catch was tobacco. The main harvest was tobacco, and in the New England, those people were engaged in fishing, handicrafts, and Atlantic commerce. In the Carolinas, economic life was organized around larger but less isolated plantations. They were growing rice, indigo, coffee, cotton, and sugar. So these were the early crops after the colonization of the American colonization by the French and the English and the Portuguese and the Spanish. So they were they were doing these sort of activities. So religious persecution was a particularly powerful force motivating English colonization. So they were very strict about their religion, and the priests were the police, and they used to give orders, and they could execute anyone, absolutely everyone on the basis of religion. So some 30,000 English Parisians immigrated to New England, while Maryland became a refuge for Roman Catholics, and Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey, and Rhode Island havens for Quakers. So refugees from religious persecution included Baptists and Congregationalists and pre-Sebastarians, to say nothing of religious minorities from continental Europe, including the Huguenots and members of the Dutch and the German Reformed churches. So by 1700s, Britain's North American colonies differed from England itself in the population and growth rate, the proportion of white men who owned property and were able to vote, as well as in the population's ethnic and religious diversity. So the Britons, they were leading. So in early and mid 18th century brought far-reaching changes to the colonies, including a massive immigration, especially of the Scots-Irish, the forced importation of tens of thousands of enslaved Africans, and increasing economic stratification in both the northern and southern colonies. A series of religious revivals known as the Great Awakening helped to generate an American identity that cut across colony lines. So, people were thinking of rebellion, that this is our land, these are our people. So why are we being religiously persecuted? That is not our religion. So they were getting angrier and angrier day by day. So between 1660 and 1670, England sought to centralize control over its new world empire and began to impose a series of imperial laws upon its American colonies. So the English people, England, they decided to bring their constitution onto the American land. So from time to time, when the imperial laws became too restrictive, the colonists resisted these impositions, and they said, no, we don't hear you, we don't want these laws, go back and go away, we have our own system, we are happy with that. And Britain responded with a system of accommodation known as solitary neglect. So they proposed this uh, solution to the problem. So during the late 17th and early and mid 18th centuries, the colonists became embroiled in a series of contests for power between Britain, France, and Spain. So they started fighting with each other. By the 1760s, after Britain had decisively defeated the French, the colonists were in a position to change their subordinate position within the British Empire. So now we are entering the American Revolution. That what were the consequences, and basically what were the causes that the American Revolution started in first place. So the roots of American Revolution can be traced to the year 1763, when British leaders began to tighten imperial reins. When they were becoming more and more strict toward the local people and the people who were living there. So once harmonious relations between Britain and the colonies became increasingly conflict driven. There used to be wars, small conflicts every day. So Britain's land policy prohibiting settlement in the West irritated colonists, as did the arrival of British troops. So now, they brought army. They sent messages that we have to control the situation in the Americas. We are not happy with it, so let's bring in the army. So, initially there were traders, and then the army came. So the most serious problem was the need for money to support the empire. The British people, they were trying to establish an army, and they needed money for that. So attempts through the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Act to raise money rather than control trade met with growing resistance in the colonies. So they started, putting taxes on the local farmers, and that angered those local people. So tensions increased further after Parliament passed a coercive acts, and the First Continental Congress took the first steps toward independence from Britain. So and the people decided that, okay, we don't need Britons, we want independence. So before the colonies gained independence, they had to fight a long and bitter war. So this is the truth. Here uh, in Asia, in the region in Pakistan and India, which is called the subcontinent, there were wars, and the events of the Second World War eventually gave independence to these countries. And in Africa, the local people fought, and after the Second World War, the African many African nations were liberated as well. So the Revolutionary War, so the British had many advantages in the war, including a large, well-trained army. The British were very powerful at that time, and navy, and they had many ships, and they were very, they were professionals by in crossing the sea, and many loyalists who supported the British Empire. But many white colonists were alienated by Lord Dunmore's promise of freedom to slaves, who joined the Royal Army and were inspired by Thomas Paine's uh, common sense. Excellent leadership by George Washington. So now came the great, comes the great George Washington. The aid of such European nations as France and tactical errors by British commanders contributed to the American victory. So British strategy called for uh, crushing the rebellion in the north. Several times the British nearly defeated the Continental Army, but somehow they survived. But victories at Trenton and Princeton and in New Jersey in the late 1776 and early 1777 restored Patriot hopes, and victory at Saratoga and in New York, which halted a British advance from Canada, led France to intervene on behalf of the rebels. So France was a friend, so France also joined the rebels. So in 1776, fighting shifted to the south. Britain succeeded in capturing Georgia and Charleston, SC, and defeating the American army at Camden. So the uh, American army was defeated at that time. But bands of patriots harassed loyalists and disrupted supply lines. The Britain failed to achieve control over the southern countryside before advancing northward to Yorktown. In 1781, an American and French force defeated the British at Yorktown in the war's last major battle. So, what were the consequences of the American Revolution? About 7,200 Americans died in battle during the Revolution, and another 10,000 died from disease or exposure, and about 8,500 died in British prisons. So, whenever you need independence, you fight and you sacrifice and you pay the price for independence. So independence is not free. You know, uh, freedom has its cost. So a quarter of the slaves in the South Carolina and Georgia escaped from bondage during the Revolution. The northern states outlawed slavery or adopted gradual emancipation plans. So the states adopted written constitutions that guaranteed religious freedom, increased the legislature's size and powers, made taxation more progressive, and reformed inheritance laws. So now we are entering our final topic for today, which is the United States after the revolution. So you saw that what happened, why the revolution started in the first place, primarily because of the British people. They were doing lots of wrongs. They were taxing people. They were, colonizing area. There were religious persecutions, and they brought an army. So people were very angry at them. And what happened? That eventually the Americans and the French, they partnered with each other, and they fought and the British people, the English people. So the United States after the revolution. So what happened after the revolution? So this is the map of the of Americas, as you can see here. So these are the states, and Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, New York, right, and Massachusetts, and these were this was the Northwest Territory, and here we have on the northern side, we have disputed. This territory was disputed between the United States and the Rupert's Land, UK, right? So this area, this huge area in gray, it was still under the control of Spain, which was called the colony of Louisiana, and unclaimed territory on the western side. On the northwestern side, this was the unclaimed territory. And here again on the southwestern side of America, there was a viceroyalty of New Spain. So this was the map right after the War of Revolution, the American Revolution, from 1789 to 2nd April 1790. So what happened was that eventually, so these states decided to come up and eventually make the great United States of Americas. So the United States faced severe economic and foreign policy problems because the land was so huge, they couldn't control it without foreign policy and economic policy. So a huge debt remained from the revolution. Paper money issued during the war and after the war was worthless. The country was completely defaulted, and Britain and Spain occupied territory claimed by the United States. The new nation lacked the machinery of government. There was no government structure, no constitution. It consisted of nothing more than 75 post offices, a large debt which they had to pay, a small number of unpaid clerks, and an army consisting just of 672 soldiers. So there was no federal court system, no navy, and no system for collecting taxes because the previous system of the British, it was it was removed. But in order to replace that, the American people, they had nothing. So Congress uh, enacted a tariff to raise revenue, created departments of state, treasury, and war, and organized a federal judicial system. Previously, uh, it was a it was a system on the base of religion. There were religious persecutions. So, but now they decided a federal judicial system, which was a secular. Okay, so we have 5 more minutes. So to strengthen popular support for the new government, Congress approved a Bill of Rights in the form of 10 amendments to the Constitution protecting the rights of the individual against the power of the central government. So the Constitution provided only a broad outline of the office and powers of the president, and it was up to the first president, George Washington, to establish many precedents. So he modeled the executive branch along the lines of the general staff. He asserted the power to dismiss presidential appointees without the Senate's permission. He negotiated treaties and then sent them to the Senate for ratification. So this to secure the nation's credit, the first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, had the federal government assume the entire indebtedness of the federal government and the states to issue currency, collect taxes, hold government funds, regulate private banks, and make loans. He recommended that the federal government establish a Bank of the United States. So his other proposals to stimulate manufacturing through high tariffs, bounties, encouragement of immigration, and federal aid for roads were defeated. So these points were not agreed upon. By 1796, the United States has produced the world's first modern political parties. Opposition to Hamilton's plans intensified during the closing years of Washington's first term. So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison feared that Hamilton wanted to model American society along the lines of a monarchical England. They were thinking that he is trying to shift our government, and he's trying to mimic England. So partition divisions deepened in response to the French Revolution and the wars between France and Britain. So Jeffersonians supported the French, the Hamiltonians, the British. So President Washington supported a policy of neutrality. And during 1793 and 1794, Washington's administration confronted a French effort to entangle America in its war with England. The Gannett Affair, armed rebellion in the western Pennsylvania, and the Whiskey Rebellion, conflicts with Indians, and the threat of war with Britain. So in 1796, Washington was able to retire gracefully. He had suppressed the Whiskey Rebellion, defeated an Indian confederacy in the Ohio country, and negotiated Britain out of its western force. So those people, they started to leave the territories. So in a farewell address, he called on Americans to avoid political partnership and entangling alliances with foreign nations. He strictly said that, do not side with the foreign nations. It was during Jefferson's presidency that the Supreme Court asserted the power of the judicial supremacy and judicial review, and became a vigorous and equal third branch of government. By 1812, the Americans believed that the only war with Britain could preserve Americans' neutral rights and national honor. So the War of 1812 was crucial for the future of the United States. It effectively destroyed Indians' ability to resist American expansion and allowed the United States to solidify its control over the lower Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. So they took back the lands from the British. So following the War of 1812, a spirit of nationalism pervaded the nation, evident in creation of a second bank of the United States, enactment of the tariff to protect industry, and a series of Supreme Court decisions strengthening the power of the central government. So the United States acquired Florida from Spain, convinced Russia and Spain to relinquish their claims to the Oregon country, and delivered a strong warning in the Monroe Doctrine that European powers were not to interfere with the Western Hemisphere. So a severe economic depression started, the Panic of 1819, and a bitter controversy over slavery in Missouri in 1819 and 1920 provoked growing political divisions and deepening a sectional split between the North and South. So these were the events after the revolution.